On one quiet night in 1984, a rock star sat on his couch watching the news. By the time the broadcast ended, he knew he had to do something. Within a year, he'd staged the biggest concert the world had ever seen. This is the story of how one man, with no experience in politics, aid, or diplomacy, used the power of music to shake the conscience of a planet. A story of fame, famine, fury, and whether good intentions can really change the world. This is the story of Live Aid. In the late 1970s, the UK punk scene exploded, with a wave of bands who weren't interested in stadium anthems or disco grooves. They played raw, fast, and angry. One of them was the Boomtown Rats, a band out of Dublin that stormed the charts with a unique blend of punk energy and socially charged lyrics. They weren't quite the Clash, but they were cut from similar cloth. Restless, political, and anti-establishment. Their audience? Disillusioned working-class youth. The kids who felt they had been left behind by both economy and culture. Their biggest hit, I Don't Like Mondays, was a chilling commentary on a school shooting in California, a haunting piano-led track that was both controversial and unforgettable. It reached #1 in the UK in 1979 and cemented their place as more than just angry punks. They had something to say. At the center of the band was a sharp-tongued, wiry frontman with wild hair and a furious gaze. Bob Geldof. Fiercely intelligent, openly confrontational, and allergic to complacency, Geldof became the group's voice and face, a reluctant spokesman for youth frustration. He wasn't just singing songs, he was lobbing verbal grenades at the system. But by 1984, the punk wave was retreating. The Boomtown Rats were no longer the force they once were. Geldof, now a new father, had time on his hands and questions about what came next. It was during this quiet, uncertain chapter in Geldof's life, no tours, no spotlight, that something on television would redirect his entire trajectory. On a quiet evening in October 1984, Geldof sat down with his partner Paula Yates to watch television. Their infant daughter was asleep upstairs. Flicking through channels, they landed on a BBC News report, one that would not only change their lives, but ultimately the lives of millions across the globe. The journalist Michael Burke was broadcasting from Ethiopia. What he described was not just famine, it was devastation on a biblical scale. Emaciated children, skeletal bodies, parents who had watched multiple children die. Burke's narration called it a biblical famine in the 20th century. The footage stunned viewers across Britain. In the Geldof household, it left Paula Yates in tears. Visibly shaken, she left the room. Geldof sat, still and silent, watching every frame. He didn't change the channel. Later, he would describe the moment as a jolt. Something deeper than empathy, a compulsion. A moral line crossed that demanded action. He knew he wasn't a politician. He had no experience in aid work, but he was connected. He had access to musicians and to the media. And if the language of activism wasn't his, the language of music absolutely was. So he picked up the phone. That call marked the beginning of one of the most ambitious humanitarian efforts ever mounted by someone outside the halls of government or global institutions. Live Aid wasn't a plan yet, but in Geldof's mind, it had already begun. Ethiopia, the crisis behind the camera. To understand the impact of that BBC report, it's essential to understand what was actually happening in Ethiopia. The famine that captured the world's attention in 1984 wasn't caused solely by drought. It was a disaster compounded, and in some regions outright caused by politics. Ethiopia, under the rule of Mengistu Haile Mariam and his Marxist-Leninist Derg regime, was a country at war with itself. The government had recently emerged from a bloody revolution deposing Emperor Haile Selassie, only to be plunged into civil war. Rebel groups in the north, particularly in Tigray and Eritrea, fought against the central government's military rule. The famine was worst in precisely these regions. To suppress rebellion, Mengistu's government restricted aid access to rebel-held areas, prioritized feeding cities loyal to the regime, and forcibly relocated rural populations in massive and often deadly resettlement campaigns. Food aid was politicized, withheld, and in some cases used as bait to depopulate resistant regions. So while the images beamed into British homes showed dying children, the reality on the ground was far more complicated. Aid wasn't just slow, it was sabotaged. Relief efforts were obstructed, and behind the camera, a brutal regime was leveraging starvation as a tool of control. This wasn't simply nature's cruelty. It was man-made famine, facilitated by global indifference. Act 2. From Boomtown to Boom Mike. The birth of Band-Aid. The phone call started immediately. Bob Geldof's first instinct wasn't to create a spectacle. It was to make a song. Something immediate. Something people could buy. Something that could convert awareness into money. He reached out to Midge Ure of Ultravox, a fellow musician and producer. Together, they began to sketch the foundations of what would become Do They Know It's Christmas, a charity single aimed squarely at raising funds for famine relief in Ethiopia. But Geldof wasn't just interested in writing a song. He wanted to carry weight, to feel like a movement, and that meant gathering the biggest names in British and Irish pop. He cold-called artists, pestered managers, guilted producers. This isn't about you, he told them. This is about them. Incredibly, they came. On November 25th, 1984, just weeks after the idea had formed, dozens of the UK's most famous pop stars crammed into SARM Studios in Notting Hill. The studio was buzzing with egos, mullets, and synthesizers. Bono, George Michael, Sting, Boy George, Phil Collins, Simon Le Bon. It was a who's who of 1980s stardom. Some arrived early, some late, some hungover, but when the tape rolled, they delivered. Midge Ure had pre-recorded the backing track, but the vocals were laid down in a single marathon day. Geldof moved between booths, coordinating, encouraging, cajoling. For someone who claimed not to be a producer, he somehow ran the session like a general. The song itself was deliberately emotional, saccharine even, with lines like, "There won't be snow in Africa this Christmas," and "Thank God it's them instead of you." It aimed not for subtlety, but for the gut. Geldof knew this wasn't a time for poetic nuance. It was a call to conscience. When Do They Know It's Christmas was released on December 3rd, 1984, it exploded. It became the fastest-selling single in UK history at the time. Over 3 million copies were sold in the first few weeks. It went to number 1 in 13 countries and raised £8 million almost immediately. The public response was overwhelming. People wanted to help. They lined up to buy the single. Radio stations played it on loop. Record stores couldn't stock it fast enough. Geldof had succeeded in making the world stop and listen. But it wasn't enough. As the new year rolled in, the famine in Ethiopia continued to claim lives. The money from Band-Aid was helping, but Geldof began to see the limits of a song. The public's attention was fickle. If the momentum faded, so would the aid. Still, in that moment, the music roared, and something shifted. What began as a burst of outrage and empathy had become a phenomenon. Geldof had helped spark a fire in the public consciousness, proving that popular culture could be a force for good. But at this stage, the path ahead remained uncertain. He had no master plan, no grand strategy, only a restless instinct that more needed to be done, and a growing awareness that the story was far from over. 3. Live Aid. The day the music roared. With Band-Aid dominating the charts and raising millions for famine relief, Bob Geldof found himself thrust into the complex world of international aid. But success on the charts didn't translate directly to success on the ground. The famine raged on, aid convoys stalled, and bureaucratic hurdles made real impact frustratingly slow. The groundswell under the Band-Aid movement reached the United States. The singer, actor, and American civil rights activist Harry Belafonte was deeply moved by the Ethiopian famine and the success of Do They Know It's Christmas. But he felt a pang of unease. Almost all the major artists involved in Band-Aid and the upcoming Live Aid were white. The optics bothered him. The implicit narrative of white saviors rescuing Black Africa. Belafonte believed that African American artists needed to be visibly engaged, not only to amplify the message, but to demonstrate solidarity. He reached out to Quincy Jones, who in turn began contacting major names in the US music industry, including Michael Jackson. It was Jackson who made the call to Geldof. "Hi, Bob. It's Michael Jackson," the voice said. Geldof hung up. He thought it was a prank. The second time, Jackson tried again. "Bob, this is really Michael." Again, Geldof slammed the phone down. The third time, eventually convinced, Geldof took the call. Jackson explained that he and others wanted to organize something big, their own response to the famine. They wanted to show the world that Black artists were just as committed to the cause. "We want to help," Jackson said. "We want to do our own Live Aid right here in the US. Can you help?" And so Geldof flew to the United States to join forces with a lineup of musical giants. What followed would become We Are the World, another history-making Cherry single that echoed Band Aid's success, with a uniquely American and more diverse identity. But as Do They Know It's Christmas soared to the top of the charts, a storm quietly brewed in Westminster. Under existing rules, the charity single was subject to value-added tax, or VAT, meaning a slice of every sale would end up in the government's coffers. For Bob Geldof, this was more than a technicality. It was a moral outrage. The idea that the UK government, led by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the face of fiscal conservatism, would profit from a song intended to feed starving children was, in his words, disgusting. Geldof went on the offensive. He didn't lobby quietly. He went to the press, lambasting the government in interviews and calling on the public to demand change. The pressure campaign wasn't subtle. "You don't tax people for giving," he thundered. Thatcher, notoriously unmoved by emotional appeals, held the line at first. Her government insisted rules were rules, but public opinion shifted rapidly. Letters flooded Downing Street. Radio hosts fumed. The optics were terrible. Eventually, and reluctantly, the government caved. Thatcher's cabinet arranged for the VAT from Band Aid sales to be refunded, effectively nullifying the tax and allowing the full proceeds to go to famine relief. It was a significant victory, not just financially, but symbolically. Geldof had stared down the Iron Lady and won. More importantly, he had demonstrated the power of public moral leverage in the face of bureaucratic indifference. While the UK battled its government over VAT, the American response to the famine was taking shape in Los Angeles. We Are the World. Written by Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie, produced by Quincy Jones, and recorded in January 1985, brought together an extraordinary constellation of stars, from Stevie Wonder and Bruce Springsteen to Ray Charles, Diana Ross, and Cyndi Lauper. The song's recording session at A&M Studios famously included a sign on the door, "Check your ego at the door." And remarkably, they did. That night, 46 of America's biggest music icons sang together, united not by genre or image, but by purpose. The single was released in March 1985 and was an immediate smash. It debuted at number 21 on the Billboard Hot 100, the highest debut in the chart's history at that time, and quickly climbed to number 1. It sold over 20 million copies worldwide, raising more than $60 million for famine relief. It wasn't just a musical milestone. It was a cultural one. It proved that mass media, celebrity influence, and genuine goodwill could merge into something world-changing. And it reaffirmed to Geldof and others that there was still more they could do. By early 1985, the landscape had shifted. Between Do They Know It's Christmas in the UK and We Are the World in the US, over $100 million had been raised. The songs were global chart toppers, but more importantly, they had dominated the headlines and reshaped the conversation around famine relief. Millions of people who had never thought about Ethiopia were suddenly invested. Donations surged not just through record sales, but through phone lines, letters, and fundraisers in schools, churches, and workplaces. Governments that had previously dragged their feet were now pledging aid. The sheer visibility of the crisis, amplified by celebrity, media, and music, had changed the political equation. But even with the influx of funds, the practical impact on the ground remained slow. Food and medicine were piling up at bottlenecks, stuck in ports, mired in bureaucracy, or rerouted due to internal conflict within Ethiopia. The famine was still claiming lives. Geldof, no longer just a rock star but now a full-time humanitarian agitator, was growing impatient. He had seen what awareness could do, but he also saw its limits. Then came a new idea. Not just a song, not just a plea. A concert. Not one stage, not one country, a global event. A musical broadcast that could unite the world in a single day of action. What if the entire globe could watch, give, and be moved in real time.
That seed of a thought would become Live Aid.
The date was set, July 13th, 1985. The locations? Wembley Stadium in London and JFK Stadium in Philadelphia. The broadcast would be patched together by the BBC, MTV, and satellite feeds, reaching an estimated 1.5 billion viewers across 150 countries, nearly 40% of the global population at the time.
It had never been done before. Once again, Geldof worked the phones. This time, the stakes were higher. He didn't just want UK artists. He wanted everyone. Some artists agreed immediately. David Bowie, U2, Queen, The Who, Elton John. In the US, Bob Dylan, Tina Turner, Madonna, and Led Zeppelin signed on. Even reluctant acts, like Paul McCartney, who hadn't performed live in years, agreed to appear.
Behind the scenes, chaos reigned. Coordinating the satellite feeds, security, staging, and logistics across 2 continents was a monumental task. Technicians scrambled, promoters sweated, artists rehearsed on planes, but the momentum was unstoppable. At noon on July 13, Wembley erupted with cheers as Status Quo launched into Rockin' All Over the World. What followed was 16 hours of live performances spanning continents, genres, and generations. U2's set became iconic, especially Bono's spontaneous leap into the crowd to dance with a fan, a moment of raw human connection. Queen, however, delivered what is widely regarded as the most electrifying performance of the day. Freddie Mercury's Command of the Stage turned their 20-minute set into a masterclass of live performance. So powerful, it allegedly caused a spike in electricity use across the UK as people got up to make tea afterwards. In Philadelphia, Phil Collins famously performed at both venues, flying on the Concorde between London and Philly to appear twice in one day. Dylan, Richards, and Ronnie Wood closed the US event with a ragged but heartfelt acoustic finale. The event was raw, occasionally chaotic, and technically imperfect. But it worked. Live Aid raised over £125 million, around $150 million. And perhaps more importantly, it reignited global focus on Ethiopia and famine relief. Geldof dubbed it the global jukebox. For 16 hours, the world didn't just watch, it participated. People gave, politicians took notice. Suddenly, famine wasn't a distant tragedy. It was a shared, immediate crisis. The concert demonstrated that mass media could be weaponized for good, that pop culture could carry moral weight. But even in its triumph, questions loomed. Was the money reaching the right people? Were governments doing enough? Was this moment sustainable, or merely a flash of conscience? Act 4. Where did the money go? By the time the echoes of Live Aid began to fade, Bob Geldof was no longer a rock star. He was a global moral force. The concert had drawn in over 1.9 billion viewers across 150 countries, raising an estimated $127 million for famine relief. The spectacle was unprecedented, and so was the scrutiny. Questions began to swirl almost immediately. Where was the money going? How would it be spent? Would it even reach the people it was meant to save? Geldof had in many ways willed Live Aid into existence through sheer force of will and moral indignation. But what began as a righteous fury was now being asked to operate like a well-oiled humanitarian operation. Transparent, accountable, and answerable. Even before Live Aid, Geldof had run into institutional resistance. The now resolved VAT debacle had seen him go toe-to-toe with Margaret Thatcher, a victory that earned him public admiration, but also political enemies. But the questions surrounding aid distribution were more complex and more damaging. As journalists began to dig, uncomfortable truths emerged. Some of the aid money was allegedly being diverted by the Ethiopian government, then under the Marxist-Leninist dictatorship of Mengistu Haile Mariam. The regime, embroiled in civil war and counterinsurgency, was accused of using humanitarian aid, or the promise of it, as a bargaining chip. In some cases, grain and supplies were intercepted, redirected to government-controlled areas, or used as leverage against rebel regions. In extreme allegations, entire populations were reportedly displaced under the guise of aid distribution. Geldof and Band-Aid trust officials defended their position. They insisted that the vast majority of aid reached its intended recipients, and that they had relied on well-established NGOs such as the Red Cross and UNICEF to manage logistics. But damage to the moral clarity of the campaign had been done.
The British press, once enamored with Geldof's passion and purpose, became sharply divided.
Some saw him as a messianic figure, a man who had shaken the world awake. Others began to question whether he had moved too fast, too forcefully, and without sufficient planning. Critics ask, should entertainers lead humanitarian campaigns? Could emotional appeals replace due diligence? Was Geldof, in his righteous fury, blind to the political realities of the Horn of Africa? The criticisms weren't entirely without merit. Live Aid had been conceived and executed in record time. Systems for auditing, follow-up, and transparency had lagged behind. Geldof, who had always rejected bureaucracy as a tool of inertia, now found himself accused of the very chaos he once fought against. Yet, paradoxically, it was this very urgency that had made Live Aid possible. As Geldof returned to private life, albeit never fully, he carried the weight of the questions he could not answer. He was knighted. He was praised by world leaders, but he was also haunted by the fragility of good intentions. No longer simply a performer or campaigner, he had become a symbol of a movement, and a cautionary tale of how morality, celebrity, and global politics intertwine. Live Aid had changed the world, but it had also exposed its complexities. And for Geldof, the man who dared to shake the conscience of a generation, the story wasn't over. It was merely evolving. Act 5, The Legacy, 40 years on. In the decades since Live Aid, the world has changed, and so has Africa. But the complexities that spurred the original Band-Aid movement have not vanished. They've merely evolved. Ethiopia today is a country marked by contradiction. Once synonymous in the Western imagination with starvation and suffering, it is now a nation of remarkable resilience and cautious progress. Over the past 40 years, Ethiopia has experienced periods of economic growth, infrastructure development, and improved healthcare access. But it has also been plagued by political instability, ethnic conflict, and renewed humanitarian crises, most recently the Tigray War, which led to thousands of deaths and the displacement of millions. The original famine of the 1980s is no longer Ethiopia's defining feature. But food insecurity remains, exacerbated by climate change, internal displacement, and inconsistent governance. Live Aid raised awareness like never before. It established a new blueprint for global celebrity activism and changed the music industry's relationship with social justice. But its legacy is complex. Critics argue that the concert and the broader Band-Aid movement inadvertently reinforced harmful stereotypes. The image of helpless Africans needing salvation from Western pop stars became entrenched in popular culture, overshadowing African agency and expertise. Some scholars point to what they call the white savior industrial complex, a critique of well-intentioned interventions that center Western benevolence and marginalize the voices of those most affected. Others note that while the money raised was significant, it was a fraction of what Western governments spent annually on foreign policy misadventures, and too much focus was placed on individual heroism over systemic reform. Still, most of us defend Live Aid as a watershed moment. It forced people to care. It humanized distant suffering, and it established mechanisms for future crisis responses. From concerts for Hurricane Katrina and tsunami relief to the evolution of comic relief and Red Nose Day, directly inspired by Band-Aid's success. Now, in his 70s, Sir Bob Geldof remains an iconoclast, equal parts revered and controversial. He has continued campaigning on various issues, from debt relief to EU policy, often with the same bluntness that first captured headlines in the 80s. To some, he is a meddler, to others, a modern saint. But few deny that he changed the way celebrity and activism intersect. And for all the scrutiny, the missteps, and the complexities, he acted. When many turned the channel, he picked up the phone. When systems failed, he rallied crowds. When the world looked away, he shouted until it looked back. Live Aid didn't end world hunger. It didn't solve global inequality, but it did something arguably just as important. It made visible what was invisible. It proved that collective empathy, even if imperfect, is a force to be reckoned with.
And 40 years on, as new generations face crises of their own, from climate displacement to digital disinformation, the legacy of Live Aid endures, not just as a concert, but as a call to conscience. Perhaps Winston Churchill put it best when he said, "For evil to prevail, it only requires that good people do nothing." And Live Aid proved that millions, when given the chance, will choose to do something.
If you found this story moving, informative, or thought-provoking, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. At The Vanguard, we bring you the stories behind the headlines, the moments when individuals dared to act, and the ripple effects that followed.
Thanks for watching.